On the morning of the 13th of August 1961, thousands of Berliners woke up to find miles of barbed wire and barricades physically dividing the city. People had been torn away from their families, friends, and jobs overnight, and it would stay that way for nearly 3 decades. But it didn't just separate a city, it divided an entire continent as a physical representation of the Cold War.
Unlike the First and Second World Wars, the Cold War was not fought on traditional front lines. With capitalist NATO in the West and Communist Warsaw Pact in the East, the stage was set for decades of tensions, proxy wars, and the nuclear arms race.
In 1989, the Berlin Wall finally fell, shattering decades of division and spelling the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. Today, only fragments of the Cold War's most recognised landmark remain. But how did we get here? And how did the Cold War come to an end? Arguably, the most dangerous moment of the Cold War came in 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This crisis taught both sides the dangers of escalation and the need to find a path to end the conflict. For 13 tense days, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war, as US reconnaissance revealed Soviet missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from American shores. After intense negotiations with President John F. Kennedy, Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a US pledge not to invade Cuba. The standoff exposed the terrifying reality of mutually assured destruction, the understanding that a nuclear strike by one side would guarantee total annihilation for both. In its aftermath came the 1963 Limited Test Ban Treaty and the Moscow-Washington hotline, but the stakes of the arms race were still extremely high.
This is Blue Steel. More precisely, it's a 1:5 scale aerodynamic test model on display here at IWM London. Its type would have been used during tests in Woomera, Australia, before the missile itself became fully operational in 1963. Designed to arm Britain's V-bomber force, Blue Steel acted as the UK's primary nuclear deterrent until it was replaced by the submarine-launched Polaris missile in the late 1960s. This period of building and increasing arms marked one of escalating tension. The Soviet Union built up its anti-aircraft defence system in response, including artillery and surface-to-air missiles. The race to superior means of defence and first strike capability on both sides seemed endless in possibility, and more needed to be done to curb the escalation than the Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963.
By the late 1960s, tensions had risen again, as the US discovered Soviet plans to expand their intercontinental ballistic missiles arsenal. In 1967, US President Lyndon B. Johnson also revealed that the Soviets were building an anti-ballistic missile system around Moscow, raising fears of a first strike advantage.
In response, Johnson proposed strategic arms limitation talks known as SALT, meeting Soviet leader Alexei Kosygin at Glassboro, New Jersey in 1967. While no agreement was reached, these talks laid the groundwork for the arms control negotiations that would define the era of détente in the 1970s.
The SALT agreements were designed to limit the arms race and prevent future nuclear escalation, a crucial shift that helped steer the Cold War towards its eventual end.
When Richard Nixon took office in 1969, SALT I talks began in earnest in November of the same year. Taking 2.5 years to complete, Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev signed the SALT I agreement in Moscow in May of 1972. SALT I set limits on submarine-launched nuclear weapons. The US was capped at 710 missile launchers and 44 submarines. The Soviets were allowed 950 launchers and 62 submarines. Both sides could modernize but not expand beyond these limits. However, as SALT I did not cover further advancements in technology, SALT II talks also began in 1972. After years of negotiation, President Jimmy Carter and Leonid Brezhnev signed the Second SALT Treaty in Vienna in 1979.
Despite this progress, the path towards ending the Cold War did not always run smooth. The late 1970s and early 1980s saw a temporary return to escalation.
The first SALT agreement had limited some nuclear weapons, but it didn't cover the newly introduced Soviet SS-20 missiles. In response, NATO began deploying Pershing II and cruise missiles in Europe, including the UK and West Germany. In 1979, tensions spiked. Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan and killed President Amin, fearing he might work against them to improve Afghanistan's relations with the Americans. The combination of SS-20 missiles and Soviet forces in Afghanistan caused US hopes for progress in SALT II talks to collapse. President Carter imposed grain sanctions on the Soviet Union, boycotted the Moscow Olympics, and withdrew the SALT II treaty from the Senate. The decade of détente was over.
When Ronald Reagan came to power in 1981, he adopted a far tougher approach to the Cold War. His 1983 Strategic Defense Initiative made this clear. Presented as a technological alternative to nuclear deterrence, SDI immediately sparked controversy. Many doubted whether such a defense system was even feasible, but the greater fear was that it would undermine the balance of mutually assured destruction. By seeking protection against ballistic missiles, the United States appeared to be pursuing a strategic advantage, and the Soviets saw this as a provocative escalation. SDI also raised the alarming prospect of pushing the arms race into space, deepening mistrust and marking a decisive shift back towards tension and competition. As the arms race intensified and tensions escalated in the Middle East, people around the world tried to make their voices heard. In 1983, the streets of London became the stage for one of the largest peace movements in history. 400,000 people marched under the banner of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, also known as CND, demanding an end to nuclear weapons. This was more than a protest, it was a powerful example of public will shaping policy.
Since 1958, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament has fought to rid the world of nuclear weapons. During the Cold War, they marched from Aldermaston to London, protesting both British and American nuclear bases on home soil. By the late 1970s, CND was joined by the European Nuclear Disarmament, or END, formed in response to NATO's new missile deployments. Its mission was to unite voices across Europe, amplify their message globally, and pressure governments to pursue nuclear disarmament. END's efforts would later help lead to the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987, signed by Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev in Washington, D.C. This landmark agreement abolished an entire class of nuclear weapons and marked a major step towards East-West cooperation. Individual voices became a second front for de-escalation, proving that ordinary people could help bring the Cold War tensions to a close.
Even when tensions were rising in the early 80s, inside the USSR, things were not well. The economy was stagnant, and Soviet citizens suffered from severe shortages. Keeping up with America in the arms race was extremely costly, and when oil prices crashed in 1986, the USSR was plunged into a financial crisis. When Mikhail Gorbachev became leader in 1985, these economic struggles prompted him to transform de-escalation into a policy and launch major reforms which would ultimately bring an end to the Cold War. Inadvertently, though, these reforms began to signal the beginning of the end for the Soviet system of governance.
In December 1988, Mikhail Gorbachev delivered a speech at the United Nations that stunned the world. Gorbachev declared that the era of confrontation between East and West was ending, words which would have been unthinkable under Brezhnev. He spoke of a new relationship between Moscow and Washington, one built on cooperation rather than hostility. And he backed those words with action, pledging to cut strategic offensive arms by 50% and to reduce Soviet troop numbers by 500,000 within 2 years. This speech marked a decisive shift in Soviet policy and would go on to mark the beginning of the end for the Cold War. Gorbachev's reforms of glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring, transformed the Soviet Union from within. Glasnost allowed freer media and criticism of government officials, something which was unimaginable under previous leaders. Perestroika aimed at modernizing the economy, inviting Western investment and loosening state control. These changes were bold, but they exposed deep cracks in the system. Economic stagnation, food shortages, and the crushing cost of the arms race had already weakened the Soviet Union. By the late 1980s, even basic grain had to be imported from the West. The Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989 was another turning point. After a decade of costly war, 15,000 Soviet soldiers dead, millions of Afghan lives lost, the Kremlin could no longer sustain its military ambitions. Glasnost meant the Soviet press could finally report openly on the war, fueling public anger and accelerating the push for change.
Strong leadership in the 1980s was crucial for setting the stage for the Cold War's end. The collaboration between US President Ronald Reagan, the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev created the diplomatic environment necessary for major arms control agreements and improving relations between the East and West. Reagan combined military pressure with arms reduction proposals. Thatcher acted as a trusted and determined intermediary, earning the nickname the Iron Lady, and Gorbachev embraced change and a willingness to engage with Western leaders.
This climate of cooperation resulted in several agreements, culminating in the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty known as START I. Signed on the 31st of July 1991 by US President George H.W. Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev, START I was the first treaty to mandate actual reductions in the number of strategic nuclear weapons, rather than just limiting growth.
As the 1980s drew to a close, Gorbachev's reforms and the withdrawal from Afghanistan signalled the Soviet retreat from hardline control. Unlike Brezhnev, Gorbachev allowed countries in Central and Eastern Europe to determine their own affairs, leaving Eastern Bloc regimes exposed. This paved the way for upheaval in Berlin and beyond.
By 1989, East Germans were growing tired of their leader Erich Honecker's resistance to change. In contrast, other Eastern Bloc countries and their people embraced the reforms under Gorbachev, leading to winds of change across Europe. In Poland, the Solidarity Union was key to ending communism in the country. As Hungary's borders also opened, East Germans began fleeing through Austria, even before the Berlin Wall fell.
At this time, protests were erupting across Europe, and within months, the Soviet Union and the entire Warsaw Pact began to unravel, as one country after another broke away in a domino-like collapse. East Germany was now on the brink of doing the same.
East Germany was a police state. The Stasi, its secret police, had long spied on citizens and crushed press freedom. As protests grew and clashes with police erupted, Honecker was forced out. The Soviet Union no longer backed his hardline rule, and its grip on the region was weakening. From September 1989, thousands attended demonstrations in East Germany and called for the wall to come down. People wanted free movement, democracy, and a better life. Then, in November, a press conference mistakenly announced the border was open, and people rushed to the wall. The 9th of November marked the beginning of the end for the Berlin Wall. Crowds gathered to chip away at the concrete, crossing freely between East and West Berlin. A powerful moment that symbolised not just the fall of the wall, but a major step towards ending the Cold War.
The Berlin Wall was the starkest symbol of division during the Cold War. As the people reduced it to rubble and revolutions swept across the Eastern Bloc, that division crumbled.
This piece of the Berlin Wall on display outside of IWM London was painted by East German artist Jürgen Gross, known professionally as Indiano. Following the collapse of the wall in 1989, he painted 223 individual sections in just 7 months. He painted similar slogans on other pieces, wanting to convey messages for a new world, for peace, for unity, and for lasting change.
Under the leadership of Helmut Kohl and Hans Modrow, Germany was finally unified in October of 1990. For the first time in decades, Germany had no sides.
When Germany reunified and the Soviet Union collapsed, it looked like containment had succeeded. Communism's main power in Eastern Europe was gone, and Berlin was no longer a Cold War flashpoint. But for many East Germans, life after communism was tough. State-owned businesses were sold off, jobs disappeared, and they often couldn't compete with Western markets. A mass exodus of young, skilled workers from East to West Germany during the Cold War had deepened economic struggles and fueled resentment toward Western capitalism. In the Soviet Union, Boris Yeltsin rose as a popular reformer and was elected president of the Russian Federation in 1991. Meanwhile, hardliners tried to overthrow Gorbachev in a failed coup. After spending time in Crimea for health treatment, he returned to Moscow, but his power was greatly diminished.
On the 6th of November 1991, Boris Yeltsin banned the Communist Party in Russia. On the 26th of December, Yeltsin and Gorbachev formally dissolved the Soviet Union. The ideological divide that has shaped global politics for decades simply ceased to exist. The Cold War was over. Escalation had been avoided. As the geopolitical landscape shifted, ordinary people played an active role in turning up for peace. One such figure was Sergeant Keith Bailey.
These objects, donated by Sergeant Keith Bailey, were proactively collected by him between the 1980s and the early 1990s. Sergeant Bailey served with the Royal Military Police in the British Army of the Rhine during this period, specifically with the 19 Support Platoon, also known as the White Mice. This commemorative Cold War medal features a highly symbolic Russian bear holding a missile while being confronted by the lion and the eagle, which represent the UK and the USA respectively. Underneath the figures is what could be a nod to the Berlin Wall. As a commemorative medal, Keith added it to his collection of Soxmus memorabilia and as a tribute to his years in service. This Russian warrant officer's Ushanka hat with Soviet badge on the front was acquired by Keith at the end of the Cold War while attending a farewell gathering at the Soxmus compound in former West Germany in 1991. The Ushanka was given to him personally by the Soviets at the final reception just before the Soxmus mission departed Germany for Russia. The gifting of such items like this Ushanka is a stark symbol of the end to hostilities, literally throwing in the hat.
The end of the Cold War did not happen through force alone. It was affected by strong leaders who pursued dialogue and reform, and by ordinary people whose protests and demands for freedom grew louder across the globe. From landmark treaties to mass movements, their combined determination helped de-escalate tensions and bring down walls. Yet even after the treaties were signed and borders opened, the threat of nuclear conflict never fully disappeared. Today, with rising tensions between the US, NATO, Russia, China, and others, some call this a second Cold War, leading us to ask, did the Cold War ever truly end, or simply take on another form?